This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore here in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it is a real treat and an honor to welcome Katherine Corcoran here to discuss her remarkable new book, In the Mouth of the Wolf. We were just discussing previous to this, just an incredible book. And Elvia Díaz has very kindly agreed to interview Katherine, and I was trying to cobble together some little biographical info. Let's see. So I'll get as far as I can. Some of this may be outdated, but Katherine Corcoran is a former Associated Press bureau chief for Mexico and Central America. She's been an Alicia Patterson Fellow, the Hewlett Fellow for Public Policy at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame, and a Logan Nonfiction Program Fellow. At the AP, she led an award-winning team that broke major stories about cartel and state violence and abuse of authority in Mexico and Central America. Her columns about Mexican politics and press freedom have appeared in the Washington Post, the Houston Chronicle, and Univision Online, among other publications. And this is what I'm not sure about. Are you still currently the co-director of Cronkite Noticias? No. Okay.
I'm a former director.
Former director. Right. Okay. And Elvia Díaz is the editorial page editor for The Republic and AZ Central. She's the former general manager of La Voz. More than 20 years of print, radio, and online journalism experience in English and Spanish. She's interested in writing thoughtful columns using multimedia tools to engage readers. She manages and edits a diverse group of journalists who write for multiple platforms. And welcome, both of you. Thank you so much. And Elvia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, no, thank you for inviting me. This is great. So for everyone watching, I'm actually a Mexican native, so I was so grateful that you wrote this book because I follow Mexican politics and, I follow news out of there, but in specifically the journalists. But I actually learned a ton reading this book, even from a Mexican native, I spent, half my life there. So thank you for that. I mean, thank you for putting the time in writing. I really appreciated all this. So let's start from the beginning. I mean, why did you go to Mexico in the first place? And then we can dive into the book.
Okay, well, I started my journalism career so many decades ago here in Arizona, and I grew up in the Midwest. And at that time there weren't a lot of Mexican immigrants in the Midwest. And so when I came out here and I saw the dynamic of migration and Mexican American communities, and I just became really fascinated because it was a whole dynamic that I'd never seen when I was growing up. And so I started covering Mexican migrant communities here. Then I spent most of all of my career in the United States in Western states with big Mexican American populations. And so everywhere I went to Colorado, and then I went to California. It was a story, the changing demographics, the flow of migrants, et cetera, the relationship between the two countries. And so I became really fascinated with the story, and I started covering it here in the United States. But then, of course, eventually I needed to go to Mexico to cover I did a lot of work on migration and the connection between cities here and cities or pueblos in Mexico. And so that's how I got started. And once I went to Mexico, just as an American reporter for a couple weeks or a month, I covered the 2006 presidential election. I loved it. And I just thought, I have to work here full time.
And you did.
And I did. So eventually, the opportunity came with the Associated Press in 2008. And when they offered me the job, I couldn't say no. It's something I always wanted to do.
Well, you did it well. So with the journalists, I mean, there have been more than 150 killed, if I remember correctly, the last count, over the past few years. So why did you pick Regina Martinez, which is the main character of your book here, right? So of all those journalists that had been killed in Mexico, you picked one. So why? And tell us about her.
Well, certainly it was a watershed case. When I first started covering Mexico from the United States, I covered it for the San Jose Mercury News in California. Mexico was a very safe place to go around as a reporter, as a journalist. This would be like in the about 2006, 2007. Okay. And the violence was just, the drug violence was just starting to tick up at that time, but it was a very quiet country and it was a very easy place to get around. And so when I went to work there full time in 2008, that's when this epidemic of journalist killing started. And it was very surprising to all of us because, especially at the Associated Press, people had been accustomed for years and years to just go out and do a story wherever they wanted. Right. And so, so we were puzzled by these sudden killings. All of them were very local journalists. So that was one interesting thing, because if you look at other countries like Russia or I don't know, the Middle East, they often kill very high-profile journalists who are onto something very controversial, very damaging. And it was exactly the opposite in Mexico. They were very local journalists. There were no obvious reasons. There weren't big investigative reports. There weren't any obvious reasons for the killings. And so the government told us they were corrupt. They were being killed because they weren't real journalists and they were corrupt.
The reporters themselves.
The reporters themselves, right. Yes. And so, and it was very difficult to know because they never did any investigations. They would just say, oh, they were a narco journalist and end of story. And so when Regina was killed in 2012, everybody knew, people knew her, they knew her reputation. She was a very honest reporter. She was a very dogged reporter. Her work was known around the country. She worked for a national magazine, which was also unusual because they weren't heading national correspondents even. And so when she was killed, it became obvious what the real story was. That at least in some of these cases, there were narco journalists and there were cases like that, but they were saying all of them were that way. And there were so many of them, like 6, 7, 10 a year.
So that's why you picked her?
So I picked her because it was obvious that she was being silenced for her work as a journalist. And also because her killing had a huge impact on the whole country, because whoever these forces were that were trying to silence journalists had crossed a line. There was always a line that said, okay, they're hitting the local journalists, but they're not going to go after the national journalists, and they're not going to go after the international journalists, right, because they don't want to make a lot of noise. They wanted to silence people, not make noise. And so when they killed Regina, practically every journalist in Mexico reacted the same, which was, you know,
they were shocked
they can,
it actually happened.
They can go after me. Mm-hmm. There's no protection anymore. You know, in the old days, there was always sort of like unwritten rules with organized crime and certain things they didn't do. And it was, with her killing, it was all bets were off. Any journalist was vulnerable. And it was very jarring and scary to all of the journalists in Mexico.
And so you really, well, one of the things that I really liked about the book is that you humanize her. I mean, every time that I read about a journalist is being killed, there's not a lot about their personal lives, you know, who exactly what is it that they were doing. And because Mexico is really corrupt, hopefully we can talk about that. You know, your point about, well, that they were corrupt themselves. So it's very difficult to discern, you know, who's honest and who's not. So you humanize her as a person, right? To me anyway, you know, as a reader. So tell us about her. What kind of a person was she?
Well, I always say she was a reporter before her time, because at the time she started her career in the 1980s, the press in Mexico was still pretty much controlled by the government. The press traditionally had been controlled by the one-party system that ruled Mexico for 71 years. It was an authoritarian system. There was an appearance of elections, but there were elections kind of like in China or Russia, like you knew who was going to win. And that those political forces controlled the press. And so when Regina started her career in about the late 1980s, the political system was starting to crumble apart to the point where there's now electoral democracy in Mexico. And then the journalism community too was starting to feel its power as a more independent, more critical voice, but mostly in Mexico City. And so in the outlying areas in the state where she started reporting, to have a reporter who was independent, who didn't just write the official story, who went out in the street and traveled to find out what was really going on the ground, who tried to verify things with documents, who didn't just print hearsay, was highly unusual. And it really made her stand out from the very beginning of her career, and not in a good way.
Right.
She was uncomfortable to the power structure from the time she started reporting.
So the conventional wisdom here in the United States is that the reporters being killed cover crime or narcos, and that's why, you know, they're being killed by narcos, by the traffickers. Regina was not doing that. She was not covering crime. She was covering politics.
Yes, she was covering politics and public corruption.
So do you think that that made a difference with the other reporters around the country to pick up her story, to say this is not, this is something else? We're really looking at who actually killed her. Maybe it's not just the drug traffickers, maybe something else at play here.
Exactly, absolutely. Although a lot of the press at the time, including the Associated Press, the first story that we put out, it wasn't by me, but said that she covered drug trafficking. It was sort of like the conventional wisdom. It's like, oh, well, she covered, because she did on kind of a spot basis, like if something happened, she would cover it, but that wasn't her passion. Her passion was social justice issues. And she loved to cover communities that up to that point didn't have a voice. She covered the poor, she covered indigenous communities, she covered labor, she covered women's issues, she covered all kinds of things that, and the opposition political parties, which also weren't covered by the official press. And so she covered a lot of things that didn't have voice before, a lot of communities, and she came up with these incredible stories because nobody was covering them.
Right.
And so, and those were the stories that really made people uncomfortable, because she showed what the government was really doing, the kind of abuse, repression of these vulnerable communities, and how the money, the government money that was supposed to go to help them wasn't going to help them, that there were schools without roofs on them because the money, again, was being stolen basically by corrupt politicians. And so for her to expose all that was very controversial and very uncomfortable, not only for the power structure, but for her colleagues, because a lot of her colleagues went along with the old system, and they didn't like.
Meaning what?
Meaning that they would just write the official report. The government would come in with a press release, and there was a person called the Jefe de Información, who was like the city editor, I guess, and they would hand a press release, and a lot of times they would just print them verbatim. Or they would write about what a good job the PRI was doing in building roads and things. And they didn't write about the way that the PRI was stealing money or stealing elections or doing all kinds of its sort of standard practices as the authoritarian party. And she did cover that.
So if you have any questions at any time, please let us know. There's a conversation. So why did you want to write? Why did you venture into this book? What is it that you were trying to do here?
Well, I think first of all, as I mentioned, when I went to Mexico, the terrain for journalists just changed dramatically almost overnight. And we at the Associated Press, even though the international correspondents weren't targets per se, we had to operate as if we could be, or just going into dangerous territory that we could get caught in the line of fire, or all kinds of things could happen. So we had to, as the bureau chief, had to actually create a security protocol, obviously with a group of editors in New York, but that didn't exist before because it wasn't needed. And so on the one hand, we were covering these killings as the story, and on the other hand, it was affecting how we did our jobs and how we determined how to cover things safely and keep our correspondents safe in Mexico. So it was a story that I was living on the one hand, but then when I actually had talked to Regina. I had tried to hire her to do a story, so we had a very slight personal connection. But also, I knew her reputation as a journalist. She had been a stringer for the Associated Press, and you had to abide by the standards of the Associated Press to be a stringer.
Not taking bribes, not doing the verbatim.
Right, not working for the government, not
Right.
informing for the government, not
Right.
taking money on the side. Exactly. And so I knew her reputation. And so when she was killed, it wasn't. I saw it as a story that needed to be told, um, to say, first of all, what was really happening. And second of all, there were so many killings and nothing was changing. It was getting worse. It's even worse today. And so I thought, well, maybe as a foreign correspondent, the one thing I could do is I could tell the story to a wider audience. I could let people know what was going on outside of Mexico and hopefully gain support, gain some ideas, gain a wider community of support, or perhaps have someone come up with a plan to help or support these journalists. And so I wanted to tell I wanted to tell the story to a wider audience because I didn't see anything changing. Nobody in Mexico had the political will to really do anything about this.
Or here in the United States as well.
Right, exactly, exactly. It was very hands-off in the United States. And I think now, because there have been so many killings this year, there is sort of this groundswell of interest and talk, and I wanted to feed that and help that move along. But the other thing too is, as you mentioned, I wanted to show the real human impact of these stories, because they always get told in the context of attacks on freedom of the press,
right?
Attacks on freedom of expression.
That's what I do. That's what I have been writing, right?
No, but it's very important. But then you move on to, and we did that too at the Associated Press, and then we move on to the next story. We move on to the next story. And when I started to dive into this, I mean, you can imagine intellectually how traumatic something like this is.
Right.
But to see it and to talk to the people and to talk, I mean, people 10 years later are still affected by this. Her family, her closest friends, the journalism community. There's still a lot of fear around talking about this case. And so that's why I really wanted to show her as a human being and the impact that her killing had on other human beings, and how in many ways that never goes away.
And information is very difficult to get, especially in Mexico, if you know anything about that. So even when I write, short columns about freedom of the press, attacks on freedom of the press, it's really difficult to get information on the journalists themselves, and you don't know. I mean, I don't know if I trust what I read, right? Precisely what you were saying at the beginning. So you put a lot of work into finding a lot of this information yourself. And I love the way that you included history, kind of history of journalism, what was going on at the time, the various points of Regina's life. I really like that, the whole dynamics of what was happening in Mexico. But you also wrote it in a very suspenseful way. Is that on purpose for the crime junkies there? I mean, there really is suspense here. I mean, there's a point, and I specifically wanted to point one out, and I'm not going to give anything away, but, I was just fascinated the way that you structure the book. Case closed, that right. Chapter, when a character, I will say a suspect, in this case was revealed in this chapter, I went like, no. That is not, that is not possible. Not him. I mean, it is not possible. And then a few pages into it, I was convincing myself, yeah, he did it. He did it. Which, obviously you have to read the book to find out what happened. But it really is a crime story here. Was that on purpose? I mean,
yes, I wanted to write a strong narrative, something that would keep people reading just to find out what happens. But I also wanted to do the underlayment of the bigger picture and what it means. And that's why I put a lot of history and context into it. And actually the history part was, this is obviously a very serious, difficult subject. And the history part was one of the fun parts of the book, because I just love diving in and reading about modern history and about the and the various.
So you have the politics, you have history of journalism there, you have the corruption of the government, you have all those ingredients based on a crime.
And I thought it was very important to explain Mexico coming up to the point where this crime occurred and why it occurred in a bigger context, which was the way that government corruption was changing and organized crime was morphing, and that ultimately was what was hitting these journalists. And the journalists started to say, we fear the government more than the narcos. And the fact that they said that confirmed what I was finding in this, in sort of the historical and then the context for how, when this happened and why this particular murder occurred.
With all the fear and intimidation that pervades these killings, was it hard to get people to talk to you? And if so, what kind of techniques did you use to get people's confidence?
It was absolutely difficult. And I think the fact that 10 years later, even people are so afraid to talk about this case indicates that there's something really big behind it, or some really important person behind it who still doesn't want whatever to get out. And so that was interesting to me, that people are still intimidated to this day about talking to the case. I had what I would say a stroke of luck, because one of Regina's closest friends came to work at the Associated Press, and I actually hired him to cover the state of Veracruz for us. And he was a very good reporter, a young, ambitious reporter. He was of the new mold. There was definitely a growing new mold of reporters who would be considered reporters in the mold of here and, you know, independent and watchdog, and were trained to be to be journalists and not lackeys for the government. So he was one of them. He and I kind of hit it off professionally. Like I really liked the fact that he was young and that he was good, and I wanted to give him an opportunity, and he did very well. And we just came to know each other very well. And so when he first came to apply for the job, I knew he was from Veracruz, and so I said, do you know anything about this Regina Martinez case? Because it was in the back of my head. And he said, yes, she was a very close friend of mine. And so that started our conversation and I didn't really at that time have time to dig into it, but I planted the seed with him. He started giving me information. And then as our relationship grew, he was able to go to his close circle of friends who were her friends.
And see if they wanted to talk.
And see if they wanted to talk. And because he trusted me, they trusted me. And so without that close circle, I don't think I could have written this book, because they gave me so much information, but then they directed me to the people who they said were trustworthy or not trustworthy. But still, it was very difficult. A lot of times I had to be very under the radar about how and when I interviewed people. So a lot of times what I would do is I would have them come to my hotel, and we would do the interviews in my hotel room so nobody would see. And I had to pick hotels that were known, again, for being trustworthy. Like other reporters would stay there, and the owners would protect us a little bit, and they would not call the government and inform on us. And they were little hotels, like really small, you know, like we didn't stay at I did stay at the Holiday Inn, but that was like right in front of the State House, and I really felt spied on there. So I would go to the little off the way hotels, and people would come in without being detected. We wouldn't sit in a public place, and then they would leave. Sometimes I actually paid for people to come to Mexico City to talk to me so that they would be completely out of their environment. And when
So it is that difficult, right? I mean, you write here, and also obviously we know this, that reporters fear that their phones and everything is tapped, right? That someone is listening to them all the time. So did you become paranoid yourself at one point, or scared?
I did become very paranoid, because you can't, when you live in that environment, you're always looking over your shoulder, and you're always looking to see if anyone's watching you or following you. And I took a lot of precautions to stay under the radar. Like I always registered at my hotels under a different name. I bought bus tickets under a different name. I'll never know, because I didn't get any sign that people knew I was there. But I really felt like I was able to stay under the radar, because I could go there and spend a lot of time without being harassed. And so that told me that they didn't really know I was there. And I was not a super high profile person. I wasn't, I didn't want to identify myself as a reporter, and I wasn't really known in that area. I was just a stranger walking around like everybody else.
How do we know the reporters are actually being followed and intimidated and, someone, Uncle Sam, listening to them all the time? Or is it their own paranoia?
Well, there are a lot of stories that I believe of people saying that they were followed, there's an attempted kidnapping that I write about in the book. The reporters tell me that they would have people sitting outside their homes when they came to work and came home every day, like the same person just sitting out there. But now there has been proof that a lot of the reporters' phones in Mexico have been infected with Pegasus, which is a software created for governments. It's only available to governments, and it's only intended to intervene for criminal or for organized crime or terrorist reasons. And in Mexico, they use it on reporters, on environmental activists, social activists, and the opposition. And so, and you can tell that by now you can analyze the phone. And so a lot of the more high-profile investigative reporters have their phones analyzed for Pegasus. And in many cases, it was found that their phones were infected with Pegasus. For that reason, someone told me to use an American phone because the Israelis who make Pegasus have an agreement with the United States that they won't intervene on U.S. phone numbers. And so that was one of the first things that somebody who'd done this kind of work told me. He said, get a U.S. phone number. And so I had a U.S. phone number, but I put my phone in a microwave blocking envelope. I put it in the refrigerator. That's and so we did things like that all the time. And if we had to talk on the phone, we never mentioned names. Like we would talk in code, because our understanding is that when they're intervening, they're like searching for names, like either a politician's name or a city, and so we would not use any proper nouns at all when we were talking.
I think the Secret Service does that too, don't they?
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
And so actually,
So how do they tell you who they're talking about if you're finding out for the first time who these people are going to share with you? If it's all in code, what did you?
well, in person, it wouldn't be in code. It would be, this would be with people who I already knew. And also, I also had people in Mexico City who would monitor me. I went by myself because that was the best way to stay under the radar. I didn't want to go with an entourage, or people think we go with like armored cars and it's like, no, it's just the opposite.
Bulletproof cars.
Right, exactly. No, it's just the opposite. I went by myself. I took buses, I took taxis, I stayed under the radar. I took cash because I didn't want any record of my ATM card if people were looking for me. I mean, the government there could track anything. They have, in fact, one time a DEA agent, we were talking in Mexico City, and I said, what should we do about our phones? And he said, doesn't matter. He goes, if they want to get it, they'll get it. He said the Mexicans have at least as good, they're at least as good at spying as the Americans are on their own people. And so, I just, for example, I had people in Mexico City who were monitoring me. Like I would check in with them, and I would tell them where I was going and who I was talking to. And so one of my friends who took charge of that, she referred to Veracruz as Disneyland. And so she used to say, "Oh, are you going to Disneyland?" And so we knew what was meant by Disneyland. Right? Yeah.
But to your point, you were saying like if you're talking of a person whose name you don't know yet what code they assigned to that, how did you talk on the phone?
To a random source, I guess.
Well, I would say, for example, because whoever I was talking to, we would already know what I was trying to get.
Right. Okay.
And so I would say,
Where's Mickey?
yeah, like I would say, like who, like,
Mickey's on the
Right.
sort of like,
Mhm.
you know that guy, or I would say something where the person would know who I was talking about, but without saying the name. And but it would be
Right.
someone, like if it was someone I was calling for the first time, I couldn't do that, obviously. But often we didn't talk on. Well, what we did was we texted by WhatsApp, because that's supposedly encrypted, though it's not. I mean, they can infiltrate that. Then we started using Signal and other more secure. So there were never, like, very rarely phone calls. It was all encrypted texting or encrypted emails. And that way people would know who I was and what I was looking for. And even then I was very sparse about what I would share, even on Signal.
So for most, go ahead. I'm sorry, you had a question.
You know, your choice of the title for the book, In the Mouth of the Wolf, how did I'm going to read the book, obviously, and find out, but how did you, who's the wolf? And
I
Yeah.
definitely got that from the people I interviewed, because they said going there was going into the mouth of the wolf. And
So
in Mexico, it's the,
idiomatic.
yes, La Boca del Lobo. And it's kind of more of a, like here we would say the lion's den, I think, in English more
Right.
often. But in Mexico, the saying is La Boca del Lobo. And so I decided to just straight translate it, because I heard it so many times. People would say, oh, when you're there, you're in La Boca del Lobo. Or they would say, well, I'm going to go. I would say, well, okay, I'm going to go there now. And they'd say, you're going into La Boca del Lobo. And I heard
town or Veracruz?
No,
Veracruz. Actually, what they meant was into this zone.
Into the dangerous zone,
Right,
I
into
didn't
the
think it
red
was a
zone, I guess
place,
you would
but,
say.
Yeah.
Yeah, like
You're dealing with the wrong people. I
Yeah.
mean, essentially.
exactly.
I mean,
And
that's-
so they used that terminology, and by the third time I heard it, I said, that's the name of the book.
Yeah.
And but also they said other things. Like, I remember the first time I went there, this reporter who gave me entree, he said, this is a good time to go because it's election time and all these politicos are distracted. And he said, so you won't wake the beast. So he also talked about waking the beast. So it was like Boca del Lobo, waking the beast. And right, no poke the bear, exactly. And so so there was so much talk like that, because people were, especially journalists, were accustomed to really being aware and trying to avoid these conflicts or powers. But they knew, like, they were being watched. So many people told me stories about strange things that happened outside of their homes, and I had no reason not to believe them. There turned out to be a list of uncomfortable reporters that was leaked to a journalist, where the government had actually compiled a list and compiled instructions on how to spy and find out information about these people that they felt were unfriendly to the government.
So if you talk to most Americans and a lot of people that I know, and just go to the beach and they have a great time, right? Or even business folks or anyone else that go junkets and what have you, they will be listening to you and say, what are you talking about? That's not the Mexico that we know. Nothing happens, it's safe. Go to the beach, go to Mexico City, go to the fancy, expensive restaurants, and you will have a great time. Forget about that. What do you tell those people? I mean, because that's their experience of Mexico. So this is not what is.
I think a lot of people have that experience, but a lot of people just already have this stereotype that Mexico's violent and they don't want to go. And I think that's actually changing, because right now Mexico City is like the hot spot. Everybody's going there. Everybody wants to see Mexico City. So
and it feels safe, right? I mean, when you're there, I mean, clearly you
absolutely.
take precautions.
And I mean, Mexico City it's a big city, and it's more, there's not the kind of control and crime that we're talking about in these outlying areas, because it's a big city and everybody's anonymous, and there's not that measure of control. There really can't be. And I always say that Mexico City, you would think about crime there like you would in Los Angeles or New York. I mean, the crime rate there is relatively low. And so it's just like being in any big city. And so there are different parts of Mexico. I think most tourists don't go to these interior parts of Mexico where there's this kind of like morphing of corruption and government corruption and organized crime. That's why I included in the book. I mean, Mexico really is such a beautiful country. I mean, it's a magical place. And when I talk about the interior of Mexico, it's actually the places where most tourists don't go.
But you did a great job about that. You know, it's one of the things that I actually had one of the questions that if you're not a crime junkie, you can just look at it from just a foreign tourist, right? I mean, I learned a lot about Veracruz, you know, the state of Veracruz. You know, you write about the landscape, the food, the people, town life. You know, I'm hearing that was actually on purpose, right? I mean, the magical place as well.
Well, I wanted to show how it is to be in Mexico because it really is this incredible, like, diverse, fascinating, wonderful place. And all of us who lived there and worked there really experienced that. I traveled a ton all the way through Mexico, and I drove my car, sometimes by myself. And so you sort of had to gauge like where the red zones were to do that. But I went into rural places that were just magical. You could see the indigenous traditions that had never changed, and just incredible landscapes. And so that's why I wanted to include that, because that's kind of part of the contradiction. It's
a
this
huge one, by the way.
It's a very layered kind of place. And if you're an outsider or a tourist, you're not really a target. I mean, this is all about local control. It's about moving products, illegal products, and it's about making huge amount of money, and it's all by the people, the people in power. And so the people they need to control are the local people and the journalists, and so that's who they focus on. The tourists aren't really a target there. And in fact, they say that the narcos like to protect the tourism. Like, they leave the tourists alone because they want the tourism. Tourism is good for Mexico, and it's good for them too. And so there are these. I mean, like, I think more Americans vacation in Mexico than anywhere else in the world. And I think for Mexico, it's the number one
so
source
clearly
of tourism.
they'll protect that, right?
It's huge, huge industry, huge amounts of money. And so there's a lot done to protect that. But it's like this life underneath the surface that you don't see unless you're really there and you really can spend some time.
Well, this is a wonderful book. I mean, anyone reading it, whether they care about journalists or not, I mean, they will learn a lot about Mexico and, you know, the contradictions. So you really did a fine job there. I mean, as I mentioned, from the history, the politics, and what have you. But what do you want the reader to get from this book, specifically about Regina and the journalist? At times I felt that she was just this character flowing around, you know, with all so many things happening around her and the country. So what do you want readers to take away from this book?
Well, one of the things we didn't talk about is, as I was writing it, all of a sudden there was a relevance for this book in the United States, because the press was under attack in Mexico, and now it's under attack in the United States. And we're nowhere near, I don't want to say we're anywhere near the situation of Mexico, but the people who are attacking the press are using the same language and the same narrative. And there is this massive campaign now to discredit the press and cast the press as corrupt. And once you do that, people don't know what to believe, which is exactly the situation in Mexico. People didn't believe the press because that was the tradition. They were corrupt. And then these new style reporters came out to change the profession, and it was easy for the government to say, oh, they're corrupt.
And it resonated with people because they were corrupt.
Right.
Because they were part
of that system. Because that did exist.
Right.
But there's a whole new wave now of journalism in Mexico that's very good and very investigative and completely different from the past. and I think there's more recognition of that too. But so when the narrative started to converge, that was very disturbing to me, because I thought, okay, if we want to do this, if we want to go down that path, this is where that path ends up. When you can't trust reported independent information, when you don't know what to believe, that your government can manipulate you and in this case victimize you, because the government was actually victimizing its own citizens.
So suddenly Americans here, readers here, understand
the cost of exactly, I guess,
journalism, right?
First of all, with Regina, I wanted to show what journalists do when we do our jobs right. What kind of service, what kind of information, the speaking truth to power, all of the things that she did that were really helpful and that really made her very admired by her peers and gave her even kind of a national profile. I wanted to show what she did, to show what good reporters do. I think that a lot of people in the United States don't know what journalists do. They don't really understand what we do or how we do it. And so it's very easy to say, oh, the bad mainstream media, and just lump everybody in together.
Is that the reporter's fault, though? I mean, our fault by not teaching the people, or teaching the public about what we do, which is what you're trying to do.
I think that's what I was trying to do, and that's why I wanted to write it, because I wanted to show people this is what reporters do. This is how we verify. This is why journalism is different from other information that you're seeing and all the noise that you're seeing today with this information explosion. So I just wanted to show first through her, this is what journalists do, and this is how they help the society in terms of providing the information necessary for society to live, and for people to make decisions, and for people to decide what they want to tolerate and what they don't want to tolerate, to actually can change behavior. Like what we do, all we do is tell stories, we give information, but it's up to the citizenry to take that information and make change. And that happens a lot. And it's happening in Mexico too, not to the extent that anybody would like, but it's happening. And so I wanted to show that role, first of all. And then I wanted to show what happens when you take that away. Because in the book, after she's killed, it goes away. And then you see the mayhem and that the government it imposes on its own people. There are thousands of disappeared people in Mexico. There were billions of dollars stolen from the public treasury. There were all kinds of intimidation, and you called the police to report something, the police would threaten you and tell you to be quiet. And so people were living in terror. They were literally living in terror. And that was because all the independent voices after Regina had to flee for their own safety, or they self-censored and decided, we're not going to do this. We need to think about our own safety. And so I wanted to show that picture, especially now in an environment when we do have all these attacks on the press and attempts to discredit the press, what that ultimately can lead to, and what kind of society that, if we provide information, and when you take that information away, what happens to the society?
What kind of reaction are you getting about that? I mean, I know you have gone other places to talk, and you talk to a lot of people. So are you getting reaction about that? Is it resonating? Like, oh my goodness, could actually happen here?
Well, what I get are a lot of nodding heads. When I get to that part about the connection with the United States, I get a lot of nodding heads, and also the reaction I get, which is actually a pleasant surprise for me, is people in the American audience are very interested in knowing more about Regina and knowing more about the journalists in Mexico and the conditions they have to work and live under, and why do they do it, and I think, I mean, that's definitely another thing I wanted to show, is the bravery of the people. The brave people in this book are the people who talk to me. They really took a
Because they put
chance.
themselves in danger as well, right? I
Exactly,
mean, are they
exactly.
still journalists?
Well,
Without
some
giving much away from the
some
book.
no some of them are, some of them aren't. There are some happy endings in the book. And I would say one of the biggest happy endings, and again, this is something I just wanted to show everybody because I really think people don't understand what journalists do. The person who and people who eventually brought down this criminal government were journalists. They were from the outside because the local journalists had either left or were terrorized, but they came in from Mexico City. They had some tips. They started investigating, they wrote stories, and the whole house of cards fell apart. And so again, it was the truth seeking of the journalists that actually finally brought down this corrupt regime, and people were actually prosecuted. And so that's the other thing I wanted to show is, so you have Regina doing her job. She is silenced. People flee. There's complete sort of like criminal anarchy. But then reporters come in from outside and they start writing about it and they start shining light on what's going on, and the whole thing just comes crashing down.
Well, we're running out of time, but that's impunity is a huge problem in Mexico as well, but it remains so. So at the very least, in this case, there's some happy endings here, but that is not the case, right?
No,
In
it's
most
really
cases,
not in most cases. And what's really interesting, because as I mentioned, the level of investigative reporting in Mexico has grown dramatically, and it's just excellent. There's some really excellent investigations now. And so they expose these people, but nothing changes because of the
Right.
impunity. And so as part of my reporting, I asked the reporters, what is that like to, and actually it's becoming more that way here now. Like, you expose things and people don't care. They're like, oh,
Okay.
it's made up, or it's and so I said to them, what is it like to do all this work and then nothing changes? And they said, well, with the impunity, we don't expect it to change, but we still feel like the public needs to know, and maybe one day it will. And I think an impact there is that, okay, the courts aren't reformed, the justice system isn't reformed, but there is a very strong court of public opinion now. And so this information feeds the court of public opinion, and that's where you get an impact sometimes.
Like, why would anyone want that job, right? I hear that all the time, right? If it is so difficult, why would anyone be a journalist in Mexico or here? Why would those journalists be so brave, right? And here, so any final thoughts?
Well, I think it's because, and you know this, you're a journalist, it becomes like a vocation. It's something you really believe in. You do believe that this is important. What you do is important for the society. And they feel the same way. And in fact, I recently did a talk where Polo, one of the reporters in the book, was part of the talk, and people asked him that, why do you do it? And he said, because I'm an optimist. I'm a fool. I think that by doing this, someday maybe something will change. And I think that really sums it up.
I think that's a great way to end
Yeah.
the chat, right?
Right on.
Great job.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. Your
No.
questions are just excellent.
Does anybody else, I mean, we can kind of have a casual end time. Does anybody else have questions? A few that I just wanted to toss into the mix here were the book, it had a very visual feel to it. As you said, it was structured kind of like a thriller. And I kept thinking, wow, this would make a wonderful documentary series. But of course,
A crime movie.
well, it would have to be like a 6 or 8 parter, going under. I guess my question is, how did this book evolve and change for you during the writing? Did you kind of go in with an organization of what you wanted to do from the very beginning? Or did it morph and surprise you and sort of shapeshift a little bit?
It changed a lot from the very first outline that I wrote. And I would say the very first outline and even the very first chapter was very different, was much more plodding than it is now. Like it was my first draft, and it was sort of like the dump of information. I remember because of the kinds of books that I like to read, and especially the narrative nonfiction that I like to read, I had a lot of examples just from reading over the years. And the thing I always thought about is you have to end the chapter with something that'll make somebody keep going. And I had a lot of good examples of that. And I said that was definitely my goal, that I wanted to end each chapter. Um, I don't know if you've ever read the book John Lewis's autobiography. It's called Walking with the Wind. Um, it's an amazing book because it's a story of the civil rights movement, and you know the ending, you know everything that's going to happen. And he had a co-writer, and even so, every chapter ended with like a cliffhanger. And even though you ultimately know what's going to happen, I was just like, oh, I got to keep reading. I got to keep reading. And so I had these examples in my head when I sat down to write it. And so I definitely went for that. Um, my editor helped me with the flow. He made some changes in sort of the parts, part 1, part 2, and part 3, that I think made the flow a lot better, which is always good when you're steeped in something. You need another eye to help you. And so I think what he recommended helped a lot for the story flow. And I think it was pretty much always what it was going to be, because the way the real story goes, there are all these developments and cliffhangers. Like you have, you know, the search for the killer, and that really happened, that they started to focus on one of her best friends. That's what they were going to do. They were going to make him the scapegoat. That was all real. And so with that kind of material, it's very easy to create the suspense, like what's going to happen. And then you had the second reporter who was investigating and gets threatened. And so there was that material. I mean, there was just so, I obviously that's why I wanted to write it. It was such a rich story. And then what happened in the state with all the criminal activity, and it kind of unfolded, you know, of its own, I guess.
When did you start writing this, and how long did you do it continuously till you finished, or did you put it aside for a while and pick it back up again?
I started in 2015, and I still had a full-time job then, so I could only do a little bit at a time. And then in 2016, I started working on it full-time. And I I did have to stop at certain points because I hit some dead ends, and I had to figure out, okay, how am I going to keep telling this? How am I going to get around this? And also, there were times when it was good for me to just disappear for a while. Like if people started to notice that I was there, it was good to just leave. And then sometimes I needed to leave to just give my head a rest. And like there was really almost a whole year where I didn't do a whole lot of work, and I thought, oh God, I'm letting this book go. I got to get back to it. But I think I needed that year to sort of just step back for a bit, and I think once you step back, then things kind of cook in your head, but then you sort of get the energy again to go back out. But there were so many times when I thought, I'm not going to get this. I'm not going to get it. I'm not going to get it.
You were determined to solve the case, it seems, right? Like
yes, that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to do, but I knew there was a good story there either way. But sometimes you lose the forest for the trees, because you're in there and you're like, no, this isn't working. I don't have a story. I don't have anything. I've worked all this time and I don't have anything. And so you kind of like go through those phases. And then if you're able to step back a little bit and come back to it, then it's like, yeah, now I see. It was really interesting that there were a lot of key things I learned early on that didn't have significance until after I was in it for a long time.
And one of the things that also really comes through is just how generous Regina was, and how, I mean, it comes through in her mentees, I guess as you call them, And can you talk a little bit about that? You know, how did you? There were four main ones, if I, is that correct in
Yes.
the book?
Yes.
I'm sure there were plenty others on the periphery. How did you focus on those particular people?
They were her inner circle, and they were the people who never talked to anybody. And the 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 person who worked for me, Rodrigo, was one of them. And that group, you know, everybody wanted to talk about Regina, and everybody wanted to talk about the case, and everybody wanted to say she was their best friend, and they were really um, bothered by that fact because she didn't have a lot of really close friends, but people would pretend that they were, and they would say, "Oh, Regina told us she was under threat," and they would say, "Well, she never told us that, and we were her best friends." So they were troubled by the misinformation, but they also knew it was dangerous to talk, and so two of them had to flee they were pulled out by their media companies for safety. One, Rodrigo, went into self exile, and the fourth one just kind of left journalism altogether. But and so they they were getting calls all the time. We want to interview, and they'd say, "No, I don't talk about it. I don't talk about it." So the fact that I got into that inner circle and they would talk to me, that was what was new. I had all the information that they hadn't given other people, and so and there were four of them, and I spent a lot of time with them, and I just I mean I just loved writing about them. Each one was such an interesting person in himself, and I became friends, and I became very fond of them, and so I wanted to just show. And the other thing that was interesting is when you're writing about journalists, they understand what you're doing. And so I put everything I knew into this book, and I actually went over the material with them because I didn't want to put anything in that would inadvertently put them in danger. And when I went over all the stuff I said, like about Eddie's mom having to put money in his bank account, they didn't care. They were like, I thought they would go, "Oh, can you take that out?" And they did it. They were like, "Great, sounds great." And I think that's just because, number one, journalists understand what journalists do, but also they really wanted the story told and they couldn't tell it themselves. And so I think they were even a little bit entertained and amused when they saw how I created them on the page and all the detail I put in, and kind of made them laugh. And like, "Oh, I can't believe you remembered that." And so so it was interesting how open and introspective all of them were, and that helped the book so much. And like I said, if I didn't have them, I couldn't have written it the way I did.
And that was such an important part of the book because every time that I call Mexico, try to get interviews on this topic, I'm like, nope, nope, I don't know you. I'm not going to talk to you, or WhatsApp, right? Or on Signal. It's like, no, I'm not going to talk to you. So it requires that to have that.
It's very
trust.
difficult. It's very difficult. In fact, when we were covering these journalist killings, and there were a lot in Veracruz, and we would have reporters go out there, and the newspaper editors wouldn't talk. Mm-hmm. They would say, "Nope, we're not saying anything." They just shut down because they felt like that's how they could be safe. And for us, that was kind of ironic because they're media companies, they wouldn't talk at all. And there was one editor, three of his journalists were killed at his newspaper, and he wouldn't talk to anybody. And I was there so long, and I finally got a connection that he did talk to me. I went in and I spent a lot of time in he was another complete character. I spent a lot of time drinking Veracruz coffee, and he had all these local people who would come in and out, important people, and he would just let me sit there and watch what was going on. And as it turned out, it didn't really fit into the book, and he really didn't want to be in the book, but he did give me the access, and just the access gave me a picture. And so again, it just takes years, literally, to be in there and finally find the people who will open the door for you. But we had the same experience at the AP. Even sending reporters on the ground, people would be like, not talking.
One quick thing I want to bring up is that, are you familiar with the Don Bowles case here in Phoenix?
Yes, I am very much
I'm
so.
seeing a little parallel there. You know, I mean, obviously on a much smaller scale, but you know, journalist. Do you know the story, Elvia?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah,
The Republic did a really
Yeah.
good, was it just a couple years
Yeah,
ago?
just a couple a recap of
year
what
ago.
happened. But see, we're talking about something that happened years ago,
Right,
and it
78.
happened only once. I mean, horrible, but only once here in Arizona, right? And we're still talking about it, and it had a huge impact.
that's like a weekly event.
This is I mean, this is happening frequently in Mexico. You know, that's the difference, right? That's my frustration, right? Like,
Absolutely. You know, this year, there in one case, a reporter was killed for investigating some kind of organized crime and political connection. And the editor, it was a small newspaper. Do you know this one? El Monitor de Michoacan. It's one of the his editor went on YouTube and posted a video saying he was like in tears and he was like, we've lost this person, and you know, talked about the impact on his family. And he said on this YouTube video, he said, we know who you are and we're going to keep writing the story. And no lie, 6 weeks later, they killed him. And that's this year. This is a 10-year-old story.
Right.
That's this year. And I think that's why I just want people to know about it and just to think about it. And I don't know, you always, by exposing, people come up with ideas, or you get a groundswell of report or support, or you know, it's like shaking the tree to see what falls out.
and I
Remember-
guess that's what she was saying, right? I'm sorry, go ahead. I mean, we may be headed in that direction right here, right now, right? I mean, to the Don Bowles part of, you know, hating reporters and journalists, not trusting anything and attacking them physically.
Right.
Well, I knew Chuck Bowden a little bit, and you probably did too. You know, went down and, you know, he would write those articles for Harper's Magazine and like name names. I'm like, guy's crazy. You know,
Uh-huh.
put himself at great risk. You know.
Yeah, you would. I mean, you do. You have to be very careful. And if you are going to name names, you have to be outside when the publication happens. And I think that's another thing for these journalists is they live there and their families are there and they have no way to escape. And a lot of times they don't want to.
Have you felt physically threatened? Actually, either of you?
I have not. There were times when I was a little nervous because of the people who knew what I was doing, and I was like, I better get out of here before anything happens. But there was never any direct threat.
Well, I never worked in Mexico, but I mean, as a journalist, but here, I mean, I don't. I mean, we get tons of emails and sometimes threats that we report to the police. You know, we take it seriously, of course, you know, and you know, the managers there take it very seriously aware. But my reaction, only because I know about what happens in Mexico and around the world with journalists, you know, I usually tell my editors, if people want to harm you, if people want to kill you, they will kill you. They're not going to tell you ahead of time unless they want to intimidate you, right? To stop writing a specific topic. I don't know. That's maybe I'm naive.
Well, there is sort of a pattern, and again, this goes to the unwritten rules of organized crime, because people told me this when I went in there. They said that at first you'll get some kind of a warning. Like if they know you're there and they don't like what you're doing, you'll get a warning first. And if you don't stop,
But they will tell you stop writing about X, right?
Right,
I mean, that's the
exactly.
difference. Like what we get here is that I'm going to kill you for no reason, right? So like, why? But in this case, they do tell you.
right, they tell you, they say, baja los huevos. It's like they say, you know, put a lid on it. Like say you publish something and you know what it is because you've just published, and they'll call you up and they'll say, put a lid on it. And it's just an expression. Like
Yeah.
It's like an expression that they use that you know it means like put a lid on it. And then they might do something else. Like they might I don't know, like then they'll follow you, or there'll be something more apparent. And then if you don't stop, then you get attacked. So the people always say that there's usually a precursor to any one of these kinds of events. And they told me that so that I would look out for it and say, okay, if this happens, it means you should get out of there. And what happened, and what I knew, because these local powers don't have control over international journalists like they do the local ones. So what they do instead, what they would do to get me to stop working is go after the people who were talking to me. And that's why I had to be very careful that no one knew who I was talking to, because they would become the targets. And that, of course, for me, I don't want anyone harmed on my account. So that's a very effective way for me to say, oh, okay, never mind.
One of the things that I learned from this, from your reading as well, which I had not thought about before, is how the narcos themselves actually have newspapers that have taken over. You mentioned one from Sinaloa, I believe. That was totally new to me. You know, but then how do we know? How do we know who are the real editors and reporters and who are the organized crime running those newspapers? That's still that puzzling in my head.
Well, a lot of the reporters, they're what I call the real reporters, talk about they know there are spies in the newsroom. And so they usually know who they are. And so and I mentioned that about Regina, that she wouldn't make phone calls at her desk because she was worried about the spies. And they say that's pretty common, to know that there are informants inside the newsroom. And we at the Associated Press, we just assumed our phones were tapped. We just assumed that. And they probably were. But, and especially in Mexico City, the president was really more interested in what the foreign press was writing. So they had, the president would be the person, and his people would be interviewing, his security people would be intervening our phones. And I'm sure it was true at all the international offices. They were intervening the phones. But you just assume it, and you don't say anything sensitive at all on those lines. And so it's another way that erodes the safety of the press, because the press corps doesn't even trust. There's no trust within the press corps. And when there's no trust, there's no solidarity, and you're afraid there's not an ability for everyone to band together and stand up, because they're infiltrated. And so it makes it very, very difficult. But like I said, there has been a huge leap in the quality and the number of investigations. And what's happening now is there are a lot of young reporters who come out of journalism school trained, and they really want to, they want to play this role and speak truth to power. And they're working for these smaller, independent, mostly online media, like new media. And they're small offices, so there are 5 people. So all 5 people. You don't have to worry that someone's a spy.
The idealism hasn't been beaten out of them yet, right?
No, it hasn't. But I was just at a conference with an editor from the University of Guadalajara. They have a big media operation that's affiliated with the university, and he said, we're thinking of changing the name of our program from journalism to content generation or something generic, because he said the parents won't let their kids go into journalism. And so they're trying to make it more, a broader name, so the parents will let them to. Right. Or that, and so it's, people always ask me if I'm optimistic because it sounds like so many bad things going on. But I just feel like, yes, you have to be. And there are always going to be people who feel you want to do this. We have 3 people here who know what that's like. It's like you really feel like it's a calling. That this is a pillar. It's like a pillar of our democracy that needs to survive, and that's really why you do it.
That is a perfect note to end on. Thanks so much, Katherine.
Well,
and Elvia.
Thank you to our.
Hello.
We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.